Hi everyone, this is the 6th lecture for Global Business Environment, and this week we're talking about the BRICS countries. I'm going to be doing some analysis of them. In this lecture we'll be discussing what is macroeconomics, what is growth, and then we'll talk a little bit about the BRICS countries, why they're so important, and give you some information about them to kind of contextualize some of the issues we're talking about regarding macroeconomics, which we'll use in the future as well. As with the other weeks in this block of the module, this is an applied case study of several different countries, one kind of block of countries, and we're using it to actually explore one of the concepts from the module, specifically macroeconomics and growth. BRICS are a group of countries which we're going to be talking about today, and it really opens up that box regarding development and growth globally. There are a number of different questions from the module handbook which we're talking about in these weeks. And the question for this week is, how has the global economic landscape influenced the BRICS countries? In your opinion, has this been a positive change? So this week is really about that interaction between the global business environment, these countries, how these countries have been influenced by the global business environment, and how they have in turn influenced it as well. Just to make the point that that's just one of the areas we're talking about, and it's worthwhile thinking more broadly about what the implications of this topic are. Final thing about this topic, if you are choosing to do it for the seminar or for your presentation, I'd like to make sure you don't just describe back to me what the BRICS countries are and give me some data back to me. I'd like you to kind of dig a little bit deeper about what it means. So what is macroeconomics? Well, the first few weeks of the module, we were talking about the individual level, what's called microeconomics, about how individuals make decisions about what to purchase, what's the most optimum thing that they can achieve. We talked somewhat about how countries achieve that as well, looking for the maximum or optimum marginal social benefit and marginal social costs. Here we're talking about how the bigger global forces interact with each other, which is why the World Bank talks about macroeconomics being the study of the performance of economies, how changes in economic output, inflation, interest rates, foreign exchange rates, and the balance of payments all interact with each other. It's about poverty reduction, social equity, and sustainable growth. And these things are only possible with sound monetary and fiscal policies. Now, obviously, that's a particularly laden set of principles there. But I think it's worthwhile exploring that. That's the dominant Western worldview about what macroeconomics and the macroeconomic environment is. The first component to talk about this week is what is GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product of a country, which the IMF defines as being the monetary value of the final goods and services produced in a country in a given period. I've given you the link below there. It's a way to measure how much an economy is producing and how it compares, therefore, to other economies as well. For instance, our discussion last week about Ricardian economics is only really possible if we know what's actually being produced. This level of GDP is usually produced by statistics offices at a national level and then aggregated through the World Bank, through the IMF, through the WTO, through the UN, through different bodies like that. And it's worthwhile bearing in mind that often these figures are adjusted later on to reflect the fact that maybe an estimation during one quarter of a year hasn't been quite accurate, and actually it takes a while for measurements to filter through. So just like with inflation, sometimes we see GDP figures revised a year or so later. There are different ways to measure GDP. It can be on production, i.e. how much is produced. It can be on expenditure, how much is spent. And it can be on income as well, what's the gross aggregate of income as well. I think what's important is that GDP gives you an indication about the overall size of an economy, but it doesn't tell you what it's like to actually live in that country. Countries with very high GDPs may not always be that great to live in if you're a normal citizen. So there are other indices which help you with the standard of living in a country. The UN Human Development Index is one, which is worthwhile looking up in your own time. The country of Bhutan, though, actually has its own happiness index with which it uses to measure itself, although not many other countries unfortunately publish their happiness index. Now, when we're talking about GDP, we quite often talk about growth as being associated with it, and quite frequently we'll discuss how GDP has grown in a given year. And growth is sometimes criticised for being discussed and avoided. It's kind of this nebulous kind of concept where we talk about needing growth. Why do we need growth? What is it always talked about in terms of economics? Well, at a basic level, in order to be able to prevent a fall in standard of living, we need to make sure the economy keeps growing to reflect the number of people living in a country. Otherwise, that amount of money that's shared amongst everybody in the country would obviously have to go a bit further. There may be issues regarding that. Equally, the amount of growth shows us how productive different countries are with what they've got. Now, there is a sort of, on the screen here, I've got a good indication of what's estimated to be this year's GDP growth for major economies around the world. We can see the United States is estimated to get something like 9.2%, which is a significant proportion of the global growth level. China is supposed to make up about 28% of global growth in the coming year, and the countries on screen in total equate to about 78% of all growth in the globe this year. That's not to say that these are the actual growth figures for these countries. This is the proportion of global growth. So the problem with growth figures is it doesn't tell you who gets the money. Now, this graph kind of does in terms of who globally gets the money, but it doesn't tell you who within the country gets the money. So there may be a massive concentration within a small group of companies which may account for most of the growth in a country. For instance, the United States has seen the Dow Jones index kind of increase massively. The share worth, capitalization of companies within the US increased massively, and that's led to a huge amount of the proportion of growth. It doesn't mean that everybody feels better off in the US. There's a debate as well regarding trickle-down economics, and this is a principle that if there is enough growth and the economies are growing, therefore eventually some of the money that's being produced and the productivity that's being produced will trickle down to other people in society. So if a company makes money, it'll pay more to its staff, who then can spend it in the local shops, and it'll filter through the economy, and we'll have these great positive externalities and a multiplier effect from that growth. That's not always been the case, though. I think there are plenty of critiques about that. On the whole, though, we're talking about growth being really driven by new markets, new technologies, new innovations in the ways of doing things, being more productive, having better systems and communication processes, which lead to better opportunities for companies to do things more effectively and therefore have more consumption from what they produce, leading to a greater level of production and gross domestic product from a country as well. In terms of growth, though, it is different to the absolute output level for a country. And as I mentioned before, well, I'll go through in a second, I'll show you some figures which actually show what levels different countries are at. First of all, I just want to talk a little bit about where this moniker of the BRICS has come from. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and sometimes South Africa. The S here on the screen here is large. The S in the original report published by Goldman Sachs was small. It was saying that actually the big countries growing in the future were Brazil, Russia, India, and China. This concept was coined in 2001 by Jim O'Neill, who worked at Goldman Sachs, and went on to later be the foundation for a formal interaction between these countries. So the BRICS countries are these rapidly developing countries which have seen a lot of growth. And as the original report outlines, they were seen to be taking dominance in the coming century. In 2001, obviously we're halfway through the period of time that the study in 2001 deals with, which was 2050. Over time, the BRICS has become a counterbalance to the G7 and G20 groups of countries. G20, for instance, is the G7, which is the major Western economic powers, plus essentially the BRICS and other major economies globally. BRICS are looking for alternative institutional frameworks within which to work. They're looking for an alternative to the World Bank, the IMF and so on, who have particular ideological preferences regarding how they want to do things. They've got particular preponderances and political pressure can be applied upon them by the Western powers. And as I mentioned on the screen, there are political tensions with Western states between BRICS countries and the Western states, particularly Russia. BRICS countries have increasing global economic power, both in absolute senses and in relative senses. So therefore, there's a sense that if they can work together, they can actually generate more joint benefit for each other. They also have a shared developmental agenda. With having such rapidly developing countries, rapidly developing economies, and huge demographic issues in the future, they're all trying to actually develop a way to deal with some of those demographic issues and make sure that global inequality falls. The GDP of BRICS nations from 2000 to 2029, as predicted on the screen here from the IMF, is vertiginous. It's increasing year upon year. It's a really significant kind of growth level and a growth curve. But if we're looking at it compared to other nations, we can see that actually it's still relatively small in terms of how it actually stacks up against some of the developed nations globally. Purchasing power parity, do you want to mention this briefly? When we take two currencies, we can balance them out and understand how much one unit of currency will purchase across the two. This is often calculated in US dollars to allow for easy macroeconomic comparison. I want to now go through some past data regarding how the BRICS countries have actually developed using this purchasing power parity concept. So we look at where China is on this purchasing power parity graph. It shows that China's relative purchasing power globally was around 665 billion according to 2017 values, but mapped back to 1980. The US was around 7 trillion. So it's a significant difference in terms of how the size of the economy of the US economy was to the Chinese economy. Going forward to 1990, we see that China is starting to grow and America is still the hegemon globally, with Japan being second and Russia third. Still very significant, and countries like UK, Italy and France were obviously still very, very large global countries. By 2000, China was obviously third globally behind Japan and the US, but still rising rapidly. Russia had fallen back significantly. But this was to change by 2010, when we see Russia starting to exploit more of its natural resources and kind of climb the ladder again. China, however, was significantly going ahead of the rest of the pack, with India now at third. By 2016, that was the year that China actually became on a par with America in terms of size, and India was now at third, significantly ahead of other countries. Brazil being further down amongst the European states. Russia obviously being recouping some of its lost position as well. So 2020, China's purchasing power exceeded that of the US, and they took the first place globally, with India in third, and that's due to continue, and did so after the pandemic in 2024 this year, and looks like it will continue into 2029 as well, with the three largest countries globally being India, US and China. We can see sort of further down Russia potentially falling, kind of entering that mid-table kind of area amongst the older European states. What's interesting here though is that these more established states are in the darker blue colour, more advanced economies, but they're all now in the mix amongst other emerging and developing economies, which by this point, due to the demographics and size, will have significantly grown. So if we look at the relative size of the BRICS countries, the G7 compared to the BRICS this year, I'm looking at it as a proportion of the global economy. The rest of the world, i.e. non-aligned countries, are worth about 30 trillion. The whole G7 bloc is worth about 45 trillion, and the BRICS countries are worth about 30 trillion, led by China. Now, this is the GDP absolute measurement, not the purchasing power parity measurement, which I've mentioned previously, which is where you level out the level of, you take out some of the differences in terms of exchange rates to give you a more balanced figure. Demographics and growth rate factor into longer term predictions, which is what we've just seen in 2029 figures, where just purely in terms of demographics, we're seeing China and India being larger countries, therefore they're able to produce a lot more in those countries. Going through the different countries now, starting with Brazil, the biggest component of their economy is their agricultural output. They've got significant manufacturing as well, but I think their agricultural output exceeds that. They've got huge natural resources which they can draw upon for that as well. And as a result, they've got a really good export industry. There's lots of challenges, however, regarding Tier 4 climate change emissions, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks' time, and their stewardship of the Amazon rainforest as well has come under some attack. There's also issues regarding inequality in their country, with lots of concentration of the wealth that have actually generated through this extractive economic activity staying within a small number of people. There's some infrastructure challenges, and there's a need for infrastructure investment, and that does hamper some of their potential productivity. In terms of the economic output, in terms of the overall GDP, looking at the Brazilian real, they've grown significantly and consistently. Even during the pandemic period, they didn't drop as far back as some other states did. So they've done very, very well. However, unemployment has been an issue, with up to 15 million being unemployed during the pandemic. But actually, the late 2000s or late 2010s was actually very difficult for them in terms of unemployment. And there's been some political upheaval as a result of that. The final graph I've got on the right-hand side shows overall GDP growth. When we see it go below zero, up to -4, we can see that 1979, 1980, late 80s, early 90s, and then obviously in the 2010s, so a really huge recessionary periods as well for the economy. So I think they've not had an easy ride of it. Russia has been a difficult one because they've transformed their economy into becoming an energy superpower for the region. They rely a lot, therefore, on exports, particularly to European states from about 2000 onwards, which saw their GDP really grow from 1998 onwards until only very recently, where we saw some difficulties regarding Ukraine. Their GDP percentage change, again, that's a reflection of their recession or kind of growth periods. And when it drops below zero, we're seeing a percentage change which is negative, and therefore there's a contraction in the size of their economy. And again, that tracks with the overall purchasing power parity graph I've got on screen there as well. They have huge natural resources though, and a very well developed manufacturing industrial base. So in terms of the raw metrics, Russia are very well equipped to become a well developed economy. India's had rapid economic growth, and if we see from 2000 onwards, really, that's been vertiginous. It's been a straight line upwards, really. Huge demographic advantages because they've got lots and lots of working age individuals who are of high educational level, and it gives them a real boost for their economy. This means that lots of technology sectors globally have sought to exploit that advantage that they have in terms of growth there. But there are challenges around infrastructure, particularly kind of moving goods around the country, moving around the country in general, and also wealth inequality. The final graph I've got here just contrasts the labour force participation rate between India in blue and the USA in grey, where we can see that actually India's got a very low participation rate in terms of the economy. There could be a lot more people working who aren't producing anything in India. So that's a challenge that they're going to have to deal with in the future. China has global economic dominance and is the outlier in terms of the BRICS countries. It's the significant new hegemon globally. And a manufacturing powerhouse with advantages in many different sectors, particularly high tech and kind of advanced industrial manufacturing techniques. There's been a new Belt and Road Initiative for the last 10-15 years where they've sought to establish a coherent supply chain from China across to Europe and across their major markets around the world and down to India as well. And when that's all completed, actually that could be a significant new advantage for China as well. There are, however, challenges around demographics in the future, and the graph I've got on screen here from the Economist shows, looking at the pale blue, that's the number of elderly people in the country, whereas the dark blue is the number of working people in the country, which is falling over time and is predicted to continue to fall up until 2040, where we'll have a significant advantage now in terms of working age population. In the future, there may have challenges. Also, finally, as well, I think it's worth mentioning that there are some regulatory controls issues which are sometimes said to stymie innovation, and those are really around things like partnering with local industrial partners to make things, sharing of IP, intellectual property, and other controls and FDI inflows, which actually might, if China relaxed some of those, might have given them an advantage earlier as well. South Africa is the outlier. It's the smallest country of all the BRICS nations in terms of what we're looking at, the core group. It's only 65 million or so. Mining and natural resources are around 8% of the GDP, but a huge employer in the economy as well. They've got a very stable governance system, but there are some political challenges ongoing, and one of those is around corruption. They're about mid-ranking in terms of the Transparency International Index, which shows how corrupt a country is, and that's not by any means bad. It's just they have some more work to do there to become a really top-flight economy. There are lots of social and economic challenges to do with poverty and to do with inequality in the country, which they are eager to resolve. And actually, if we sort of see how they've actually focused upon healthcare, for instance, between 2003 and 2008, there was a significant increase in life expectancy, and I expect the next measurement period to be something similar as well. It's still fairly low globally and compared to developed economies, but it's still much, much better than it was only a generation ago. There are demographic challenges, however, but I think it's another country which has got lots of the right materials in place to actually kind of grow very rapidly across the next couple of decades as well. The Plus nations are slightly richer in terms of their population, in terms of their overall earnings and ownings per population per head. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia, UAE are very sort of wealthy nations, but relatively small. Argentina is rather larger. Egypt and Iran, Ethiopia are also joining as well. So these are all the most stable, most potential, kind of embodied within the alternative sphere of influence that might be seen around the world. And it really expresses that kind of idea I mentioned last week about the kind of bipolar world. This is much more bi or multipolar in terms of its the dynamics. So what are the BRICS doing? Lots of joint initiatives, and it's quite interesting to see how they've been trying to create this alternative institutional structures. The New Development Bank, the NDB, has been put together by the BRICS nations to actually kind of function much the same way as the World Bank has done, or the IMF, and be a sort of nexus point for collaboration and discussion regarding economic policy. To help support that, they've put together a contingency reserve arrangement, which different nation states can draw upon, which initially started off with China putting in the greatest proportion of money, with South Africa relatively little, just to reflect the size of their economies. But this is to really help out those other nations who may be in immediate trouble, for instance, as an alternative to going to the IMF or the World Bank for a loan. The nations are also trying to establish bilateral and multilateral trade agreements between themselves outside of some of the international accords which may be in place. And this is to really kind of get around USA global trade dominance and some of the impositions that they feel the USA puts upon them. There's also recently, in the last week, been announced a new currency exchange system, which is to kind of move away from, again, dependence upon the dollar, which is being a significant bugbear for the countries. And then they would therefore have control of their own interchange and exchange system. Part of that is, of course, due to the locking out of the global exchange system that Russia has suffered as a result of their invasion of Ukraine. There are some significant challenges facing the BRICS. There are internal economic issues within the nations in terms of disparities, in terms of equality, and they're significant. They may actually lead to significant issues regarding the demographics as well. There's also significant differences between the nations. I mean, the BRICS thesis when it first came out was contested because really what did China have to do with South Africa in terms of size and scale? And I think the same argument really comes out here as well. The original report's author has challenged it in the last 5 years or so and said, well, look, actually, my predictions probably weren't accurate in all cases. China, yes. India, maybe yes. Others, maybe not so. There are geopolitical tensions. I mentioned Russia several times and Ukraine. I think as well, the way we could compare this bloc to other international blocs is quite difficult. It's been compared at times to ASEAN or the EU, and it really isn't. It doesn't have transparent governance. It doesn't have a sort of transparent modus operandi or decision-making processes. Very similar to the G7, it could be argued, but I think the G7 is still operating broadly within a context of an established framework, whereas the BRICS are very new and still feeling their way through it. Finally then, so how is the global economic environment and the BRICS interacting? What's that interplay like? Well, more autonomy is wished for by these countries, and they want to actually move away from the dollar and dollarization as being one of the significant factors in that plays out in terms of how they interact with other states and how trade is established. I think that's an interesting decision or interesting move on their part to say, well, actually, look, some of the issues we're dealing with that other nation states have tried to address through closer working don't apply to us because we're so different. However, raw trade interplay between our nation states is important, and maybe we need more control over that, more control of the systems of exchange between states, and therefore having our own trading bloc is really important in that respect. Having a set of alternative financial institutions is really interesting as well, and they are in the process of creating an alternative structure to that which is represented by the UN, the World Bank, the IMF or the WTO. I mentioned the UN there purely because I think it's interesting to see that these institutions are financial ones that sit alongside this diplomatic one, and the BRICS still has a political and social demographic, so kind of function as well. It's still a powerful platform that allows these nation states to speak on the global stage. I think very finally then, I haven't talked much about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in this module so far. I will do in the future. And I think what's interesting is to see that the World Trade Organization has really stalled since 2001 and the Doha round of negotiations. This was only their fourth round of negotiations to agree the rules for international trade. And for the last 20 years, we've had complete stasis in terms of what that's really looked like. There's been no progress made. So these countries have just said, well, look, we all agree on the basic principles of how we want to trade with each other. We're going to move beyond the WTO's function, move beyond that stasis and that kind of lack of movement, and try to do something for ourselves. Okay, thanks everyone. I hope that's a useful overview. I look forward to speaking to you about it in the seminars.